You're listening to the Chronicles of Roosevelt Franklin podcast.
Because I know y'all don't like to read. Eve was over 1,000 years old, but didn't look a day over 18. This fact could have made her a bit vain, had she any concept of vanity or even understood the concept of time for that matter. But having lived in paradise her entire life, she had no use for either. Her skin was flawless and smooth. It was the color of a warm Brazil nut, and her hair was jet black and seemed to shift between blue and silver as she passed through the light. It spun from her head in tight, spongy curls like a halo. When she walked, her hair bounced to the sway of her hips. She was, quite literally, the most beautiful woman in the world. Then and since. She was the kind of woman that both men and women would stare at. Men, obvious, slack-jawed, open-mouthed. Women, discreetly, lips pursed, jaws slightly clenched. Hers was the sort of pretty that may have looked somewhat out of place doing ordinary things like grocery shopping. The outline of her figure would appear as if it had been cut and pasted into the soft drink aisle as she stood turning over a bottle of Canada Dry ginger ale. She would smile warmly and say, "Hello," as she passed. And she would smell of jasmine and wood burning in a fireplace on a cold winter night. Her voice was like a lullaby being sung by Ella Fitzgerald. And hearing it, you could easily imagine her having conversations with small woodland creatures. Which, of course, she did. You see, paradise was entirely populated with the kinds of animals you might see in a small petting zoo. The animals' conversations, though, were extremely one-sided and superficial. They mostly consisted of, "Good day, Eve. Do you have something to eat?" And then, "May I please have some more?" And then, "May I please have some more?" They were like thousands of tiny little Olivers. Eve would always respond softly, "Of course you may have more." Finishing, they would announce, "I'm quite sleepy now, thank you, Eve." And then they would scamper away. The pigeons were demanding gluttons, constantly cooing, "More, more, more." And this would go on for hours. When they finally had their fill, they would flap away drunkenly, without even a thank you. Eve, though, didn't mind. Although discussions with the animals were somewhat limiting, there were conversations Eve actually looked forward to. Those with the snake. He was interesting to Eve because he had ventured outside of paradise. The snake had seen the world. He talked about the wondrous and terrible things he saw in the world. He described snow-capped mountains that disappeared into fog only to reveal themselves the next day, like sleeping giants. He recounted how he had seen a volcano that shook the earth and spewed fire and ash high into the air with its hot, angry breath. All of these things delighted Eve. Even the terrible things sounded delightful to her. She especially liked to hear him talk about baked potatoes. You see, Eve ate whatever sprouted from the ground or could be plucked from vines or trees. She'd seen potatoes, but she thought they were a bit useless. They were hard and gritty, so she didn't eat them. She left them for the animals and Adam. Adam didn't mind eating hard and gritty things, just as long as they filled his belly. The snake said that if you cooked a potato, it would become warm and soft, and that eating it was like biting into a steaming, fluffy cloud. Though there was a good deal she didn't understand, Eve loved hearing the snake's stories about the world. She enjoyed the way he described things, the way the expression on his face would change as he spoke. How he would gesticulate wildly with his tail as he described something he found particularly exciting. He was different than any of the other creatures in paradise, including Adam. They had all been there for over 1,000 years and had seen every inch of it. They'd seen every tree. They had counted and even named every patch of grass. A typical conversation might go, well, which grass are you talking about, Jeff or Greg? Greg. Oh, yeah. I like Greg a lot. The truth was, as sweet and pleasant as Eve was, she wasn't the curious type. She actually had no idea what the snake meant when he talked about cooking a potato, because there was no such thing as fire in paradise. It never occurred to her to ask about it. She simply nodded her head, accepting what had been said. The snake, for his part, liked Eve well enough, though he did pity her a bit. She had lived her entire life in paradise, and as breathtaking as it was, she didn't realize it. She had nothing to compare it to, so it had little meaning to her. The snake thought Eve was a bit like a sheltered child. He had to catch himself when he talked about things like rain or thunder and lightning, because she only ever knew sunshine. In fact, having experienced no opposites, things to Eve simply were as they were. The snake thought that the only way Eve and Adam could truly appreciate paradise would be to travel beyond it and experience some of the struggles of the outside world. Nothing too bad, mind you. He just felt they needed something in their lives to grind against. After all, a pinch of salt does make chocolate taste sweeter. The snake first mentioned the apple to Eve in an offhanded kind of way. You know, dear, there's an apple in a remote part of paradise that way. He said this, pointing his tail nonchalantly. If you were to eat it, you may begin to see the world in a new way. That's all he said about it. Eve took this news as she had all his stories. She smiled pleasantly. He went on to describe how someday someone should invent a pie to bake the apples in. Then he joked that in order to bake the pie, you would first have to invent the universe. He looked at Eve. She smiled, but he could see the joke was lost on her. He sighed after a long, awkward silence and bid her good day. Eve watched him disappear into the tall brown grass. That was the last time she saw the snake. It took nearly 10 years before Eve began to realize something was different. Her conversations with Adam and the animals were the same as they had always been, but she began to find them a bit monotonous. This had never been the case with the snake. She missed him and his wild gesticulation. For the first time in her life, it slowly dawned on her she was becoming bored. That's when she decided to search for the apple. Day by day, she would walk further and further in the direction the snake had pointed before turning around and heading back. Slowly, she began to build a map in her head. Yep, there's that rock, there's the stream, there's Greg. One day she came to a clearing. A solitary tree stood in the middle. Even at this distance, she could see something hanging bright from its branches. She waded through the tall brown grass. It took her another hour before she actually reached the tree. The apple hung low on a branch right at her nose. It was as if it had been waiting for her. She stared at it. Its redness seemed to vibrate. "You must be the apple," she said, and she plucked it from the tree. She took a bite. It was sweet and tart, and it made her taste buds spin. She closed her eyes and swallowed. A buzzing began at her temples that spread out around her head. It was warm and began creeping up like a soft cap being knit beneath her skull. She opened her eyes. She immediately noticed that everything felt different. It was as if she had been living in black and white and someone flipped a Technicolor switch. Her knees felt wobbly and she began to feel anxious butterflies fluttering in her stomach. The fluttering made her yearn for Adam. She headed back to him with the apple. Later that evening, Adam lay on his back looking up at the sky. Since taking a bite from the apple, he began noticing things he hadn't before. First, there was Eve. She lay in the crook of his arm now, telling him all the wondrous and terrible stories the snake had told her. She was different. She seemed to know things. He noticed her full lips, the way her hands moved as she spoke. He tried concentrating hard on what she was saying, but his mind kept wandering to how beautiful she was. Had she always been this way? How had he never noticed? Then there were the stars. Laying on his back, he could see them all now. How had he never noticed them before? He honestly couldn't remember being curious enough to look at them. Just how many stars were there? Where did they all come from? He imagined them as billions of tiny eyes blinking against the inky blackness. He felt as if the universe was looking back at him. "Let's go there," he said after a long pause. Eve was wrapped around him. "Where?" she asked drowsily. "Out into the world." "Okay," she murmured, and then drifted off to sleep. The next morning, they set out past the solitary tree in the tall grass. It was full of apples now. Adam took one for their journey. Eve carried the potato. The universe watched as they walked further and further away from paradise, just as it knew they eventually would. It only wondered what had taken them so long. Blah, 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 Franklin Chronicles, blah, blah, blah.